The Commission Files. Hi there, I'm Will Leitch, and you're welcome to a special end-of-year edition of The Commission Files. Something different that might make you sad, might make you happy, it might make you despair, it might also make you dream of the future that could be. Perhaps you'll reflect a bit, because it's going to challenge you when you hear someone ask the question, if I can do it, why can't you? Now that someone is Alan McBride in an interview recorded this autumn, 30 years after the Shankill Road bombing, which happened in Belfast in October 1993. That was 5 years before the Good Friday Agreement. The device, the bomb, was intended to kill people in a loyalist UDA office above a fish shop, but it went off early. It killed 10 people. It killed one of the IRA bombers, Thomas Begley. It killed someone thought to have been a UDA member. It killed 8 civilians, 2 of whom were children. One of those killed was Alan's wife, Sharon. They had a 2-year-old daughter, Zoe. The world was shocked. Alan grieved and burned with anger. His rage settled initially on the Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams, whom he followed and confronted for a long time. But those days ended. Alan's now known and respected as a committed peacemaker and worker for the Wave Trauma Centre, which supports people impacted by the years of conflict. Now, I want to thank the charity Thrive Ireland and its director, Diane Holt. Most of you will know that Diane and I host another podcast called Inspired to Act, and a much shorter version of this interview has appeared there very recently. So I and Commission send our thanks to Diane for letting us play you this interview in full. This is everything Alan and I talked about. One last thing, this might just be the last chance to hear this story. Alan has said that after 30 years of interviews about Sharon's death, he's calling it a day. He's been generous, more than generous over the years, to journalists like me with his time. He's always given a raw and honest assessment of Northern Irish society and its problems. And now he says he's done. Could you blame him? I certainly don't. Over 30 years of interviewing people, sometimes about terrible things, I've often wondered why people spoke to me. But they did. And the very least I could do was listen and encourage others to listen. I began this interview this last time by asking Alan who he is. A peace worker? An author? An academic? A victim? What? Widower? Father? Grandfather?
I think I'm all of those things, to be honest with you. First and foremost these days, I'm a dad and granddad. Wee Lila was born just over a year ago, the absolute apple of my eye and the joy of my life. So it's amazing how someone so small and so fragile can come in to your life and completely transform it in terms of your priorities and everything about this. And people told me it would happen one day, and of course I never really believed them. But yeah, so I'm first and foremost, I'm a dad and granddad of the most beautiful daughter, Zoe, who was only 2 obviously when her mother died, and she's grown up to be a very strong, independent woman, and I'm just so proud of her really, and her husband to be, Neil. And so that's first and foremost who I am. Beyond that, I suppose I see myself as a campaigner for victims and survivors. I have been thrown into this journey on the 23rd of October 1993. I see it as part vocation. I think it was what I was supposed to be doing. It was the only sense that I could make of what happened on the Shankill bomb, and that's not to say that, you know, that had to happen for me to be doing this. That's somehow repulsive, but, you know, it's about, I suppose, turning the evil into something good. I remember actually, you know, way back when I started, I suppose, my career in this, I worked for the YMCA, and at the time, this was just probably a year after Sharon was killed. And I remember reading a book at the time, and there was a phrase in the book that said that God had judged it better to produce good from evil than to suffer no evil to exist. And that really, really hit a chord with me at the time, because I was chasing Gerry Adams around Ireland and America, and there's that old footage of me standing with placards and one thing and another. And I suppose then really I sort of decided that I wanted to commit my life to actually doing something more positive, more productive. And if something good can come out of something which is apparently evil, then maybe that's a good thing for as long as I have left on this life. So pretty much since then I've been campaigning. I've been working for Wave, whom I absolutely love, and have been a fantastic organisation. Probably the thing that has given me most satisfaction in work is that I led the injured campaign for a pension. These are people who double amputees, blind, deaf. I mean, at the very serious end of disability. And I remember, going up and down to Stormont, and I remember going around Belfast City Centre and Derry and other places gathering signatures on a petition. I remember hassling every politician that would listen. And it wasn't actually until the Assembly collapsed in 2017 that we moved the campaign to Westminster. And through people like Peter Hain and stuff like this, we were able to get it over the line. And I have to say now, the greatest satisfaction work-wise is when I see those people who were out in those streets campaigning with me now getting their pension. Some of them, maybe 80, 40, £5,000 of a lump sum plus £800 or £900 a month. I mean, it's not life-changing, but it's definitely something that I'm very, very proud of. And so I suppose I'm all of those things, Will.
You've talked a little bit in the past about talking to new generations and new generations finding the past that you grew up in and the troubles and the evil that you experienced, that was your word for it, and that was the same for my generation, not really relevant to them in their heads. So there may be people listening who are saying, his wife was killed. What evil? Simple terms. What happened to your family? What happened to you?
The Shankill bomb for me, I think, actually goes way back, even before the bomb itself. And I think one of the great tragedies of Northern Ireland, one of the great sadnesses, is that we had become complacent with the conflict and with troubles. So when the troubles kicked off, arguably in 1969, and we had the high rate of fatalities in the early 70s, and those horrible things like Ballymurphy and Bloody Sunday and others, I mean, those things genuinely shocked us as a nation. I mean, I was a child at the time, and I can remember even listening to the radio and being, appalled by what I was hearing. Even a young child, and so to think what adults would have been thinking at that time. So those things definitely shocked us. But having been born through the Troubles and grew up in the Troubles, as the Troubles went on and perhaps the fatalities, they lessened, you weren't getting the 200 and 300 people being murdered, but you were certainly getting something every week or every other week. And, you just get used to it. You just get used to the fact that somebody was going to be shot in their knees, or there was going to be a bomb somewhere, or, there was going to be some random Catholic or Protestant that was going to be murdered, or that the British Army were going to do. That was the background. That was the backdrop to my life growing up. And whenever Sharon's dad bought the shop in the early 80s on the Shankill Road, it was right below where the UDA had their headquarters. It was always going to be a target for Republicans, but nobody ever took him to the side and had the conversation to say, Desmond, where you're buying this shop is in a really bad location. The UDA have their headquarters there, and someday the IRA are going to come onto the road and they're going to want to take out the UDA or at least the premises of the UDA, and your shop is in the direct line of fire. Nobody had that conversation with him, and he continued in that shop for years. I would have always had my lunch up there on a Saturday because I worked in Moores and the Butchers just the next block down. I would have walked up and you would have seen the UDA going up and down the stairs with their big boots. You could have heard them on the staircase. Sometimes they would have come into the shop and they would have bought fish, and you had that kind of relationship that they were just there, ordinary people, even though you knew who they were and what they were. They were selling stuff quite openly actually on the Shankill Road, counterfeit CDs and perfumes and videos and all sorts of stuff. Some of their best customers were the Bobby on the beat going up the road. And this was the backdrop to the Shankill bomb in 1993, because what happened that day was that luck ran out and the IRA did come onto the road, apparently to kill the UDA men that were allegedly meeting up the stairs. Now, there was no meeting taking place that day, and there's been some speculation. Alison Morris a few years ago had a story in the Irish News to say that they got a tip-off. I obviously find that abhorrent and don't believe that for a minute. But anyway, it's part of this rumour mill that's out there. And they come onto the road, left the bomb in the shop, and obviously, we all know what happened. 9 innocent people, the bomber, my wife amongst them. My mother-in-law, Elsie, wonderful woman, who we just lost actually during COVID. She had stepped out for a pint of milk and a loaf of bread for the lunch and left Sharon and Desmond in the shop. Desmond never served customers. He always was out the back boiling beetroot or, boiling wilks or mussels or whatever it was that he sold. And so Sharon would have been the person in the shop that would have, and when you come into the shop, Sharon would have said, "Hello, can I help you?" So I have no doubt that when these two bombers come into the shop that she would have been the one that greeted them. And to think that they left that bomb on the counter, looked her in the face, knowing what they were about to do, and so callously just went about that murder. So when I use word like evil, there's no other way I can describe that. I think it's inherently evil, what they did. And it changed my life. It changed the life of my family. It meant that my daughter grew up without her mother. My little granddaughter Lila now has no grandmother, and so those were very difficult days. 30 years this year, 23rd of October, and it's just been it's a lifetime, because one of the things that I realised just recently, actually, just about a year or so ago, when Zoe turned 30. She had outlived her mother. She was older because Sharon was 29 when she was killed. And I still look at my daughter as just a child, even though she's a young woman. And it just hit me really like a juggernaut, about how young Sharon was when we lost her. I mean, she was a child, 29 years old.
You've talked about a period in your life after Sharon was killed when you fixated, I think that was a word you used once, on Gerry Adams. You followed him about. You were in different countries following him about. You had placards. You rang into phone-ins when you knew it might be a way to get to speak to him. You wrote to him Irish, all those things. And then that stopped and you started talking to people. And your own community then said, gosh, Alan McBride's gone soft on terrorism, on the perpetrators. That seems to a lot of people like a major step. I don't imagine it happened overnight. But
it didn't happen overnight. Well, I mean, I suppose it started with reading that book, and this notion that God can produce good from evil, and I certainly wanted to be the good that was being produced from the evil. So I had to have a serious think about my life and where it was going. At that time, I would have been going up to Sharon's grave. I would have been up there probably 3-4 times a week. Family actually thought it was starting to be a little bit, they're getting a bit concerned how often I would have been spending up there. But I always felt at peace up there, and I had a journal, and so I was writing in my journal. And initially, it was just love letters to the love of my life that I lost when I was 29, and we had all of our lives in front of us, and then that was just so cruelly snatched from me. But then, as time moved on, and I suppose having read this book and stuff like that, I started to think about some of the wider issues around the Troubles, and I started to think about my own upbringing. When I grew up in a loyalist housing estate, my dad was in the UDA growing up. I had an uncle Cecil who I loved to bits. Was a big hero of mine, a lovely man. He taught Sunday school. He did Boys Brigade. He was a very keen Christian, but he was also a very sectarian man. And I used to think about some of the things that he would have said about Fenians, as he would have called them, growing up, and so I started to think about the fact that the life that I lived was very unusual. I mean, obviously it was the only life you had, and so for you it was normal. But it wasn't until you went to the mainland or you went over to Scotland or England or whatever, and then you kind of realise that they don't have a ring of steel around their city centres, that they're not getting searched going into shops and supermarkets and all of that. So my life growing up was very abnormal, and yet I thought it as normal. So when I started to think about that, I started to think about the people that murdered my wife, because they were young men in their early 20s. They grew up in Ardoyne, which wasn't that far away from where I grew up. The Westland. I mean, the Westland and Ardoyne pretty much border each other. One a loyalist housing estate, one a Republican housing estate. And we would never have been in each other's areas. I would have walked around Ardoyne rather than walk through it. And the same for them. I mean, sometimes when the kids were going to school, the quickest way was down the Westland Road, but sometimes they'd have taken the long way around to the waterworks or whatever, just because they didn't want to walk down with effectively a target on your back, which was a Catholic school uniform. So I started to think about that. I started to think about, did they have an Uncle Cecil? Somebody in their house that maybe, was a church-going Roman Catholic, but also had some very derogatory views around Protestants. I don't know. I was fortunate when I was about 15 or 16, I got involved with the church, the Boys Brigade. I finally became a Christian. But I was hanging out in those days. I was getting involved in riots because that's all really there was to do after school. I would have known people like Colin Crazy Craig, who's was murdered in the Shankill, UVF guy, and others as well, growing up. I mean, people like Andre Murphy would have been in the wee youth club that I would have run in the church. So I knew Andre and Ahab. They're all from the estate. John Bunting. My dad was drank with John Bunting Senior. So I knew all these guys growing up. And so I suppose for me, even though they were in the paramilitaries, I just knew them as ordinary guys that I played football with. And I suspect that was the same for Sean Kelly and Thomas Begley. So when I started to think like that, I started to see them less as the murderer, the perpetrator, the evildoer, and I started to see them as young people that got involved, got sucked in somehow, and that made some really bad decisions based on sectarianism, based on their hatred of Protestants or their hatred of the British or their hatred of whatever. And there, but for the grace of God, go I. So when I started to think like that, I realised that if we were ever truly to see peace in Northern Ireland, it's too easy, in my view, to condemn all those who picked up a gun or planted a bomb. I mean, my mother would have often said, if all those nasty terrorists could just take themselves off to the Irish Sea somewhere, get a wee island in the middle of the Pacific, and just murder each other and leave us all alone, sure, this wee place would be a great wee place. The truth of the matter is that this place wouldn't have been a great wee place because the sectarianism permeated every aspect and every fabric of our society. And if we were serious about building peace, we had to address some of those wider issues around sectarianism. And I do think that the Good Friday Agreement and things that have come from it started to get to grips with some of that. Sadly, and it's over 25 years now, we haven't made the progress that I would like to have seen us make. I still think that the Sinn Féin and the DUP haven't really understood the principles that drove the Good Friday Agreement. They certainly haven't engaged in the, let's try and make this place work, and let's try and get involved in, goodwill gestures, and let's try and understand the conflict from the other person's perspective, and let's try and see how we can get on and make this place. And I suppose the history, of murder and mayhem and all of that has made that rather difficult. I get that. But sometimes, I think you need to draw a line in the sand and you need to just move on and try to have a society that actually works for everyone. And if I can do that, and if I can say that, given what happened to my family and me, then it really does, for me, it's a bitter pill to swallow to find out that our politicians who didn't lose as much can't seem to make this place work.
You were a Christian already when that bomb killed Sharon. You were thinking about and wrestling with, as believers do, with the concepts of forgiveness and repentance and justice and a just and righteous God. And you voted for a Good Friday Agreement that let Sean Kelly out.
Yes, I did. And that wasn't an easy decision to do. I thought about it long and hard. If I could cherry pick the agreement, I would have preferred Sean Kelly to have stayed in prison and to serve his full time. As full term, but I realised that you couldn't cherry pick the agreement. You had to take it all of it, all the good parts and the parts that were more challenging. I suppose I rationalised it to myself well in terms of a continuum of justice, of right and wrong. So, obviously to allow a person who had murdered multiple people, some of them children, to allow a person like that out of jail was an injustice, absolute injustice. I know that academics sometimes like to talk about transitional justice and transformative justice, and I studied all those things when I did my masters and stuff like that. So I get the concepts, but I still have to say to you, as someone who lost someone, for me it's still a secondary justice. I'm still having to give up something which is fundamental, i.e., if somebody harms you, they're you're right to have them punished. That's justice. So what we got was not was not justice. But a greater injustice for me would have been if we'd have locked the society in for another 25 or 30 years of conflict. And that's what we were facing. Because when you think about all the various initiatives, and there were lots of them, right from Sunningdale, I can remember Rolling Devolution, talks, the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I mean, all these various initiatives that were put in place to try and bring peace to Northern Ireland, every one of them failed. And the reason they failed was because the people that were negotiating, the people that were involved in those peace deals, weren't talking to the people that were actually involved in the conflict. So they weren't talking to the loyalists, they weren't talking to the Republicans, and when they were the great unwashed, they were talking to the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party. And with the greatest respect, these parties couldn't make the peace because, in effect, their people weren't fighting the war. So the Good Friday Agreement was different, and it went into the prisons. It sought the views of prisoners, and I know that was very controversial. I can remember even now, Mo Molam, a great woman that I respect immensely, a great hero of our peace process, going into the jail and talking to these prisoners. And I know that people were appalled at that at the time, but I actually, when I thought about it, that was the only thing that was going to get this over the line, and it did. And you know what, as well, I think one of the remarkable success stories of the peace process is that almost 100% of those people that were released from prison never ever re-engaged in terrorism. Now, it's not completely true to say that they all didn't, but certainly the vast majority didn't. Nor has there been the spate of revenge attacks, which I thought would have happened, loyalists going after Republicans. None of that happened. And by and large, a lot of those ex-prisoners actually have really gotten down to working in their communities, community development programs. I mean, if you go to the Shankill today and you see the black taxi men driving tourists up the Shankill, passing them over to their counterparts on the other side of the peace wall, and the Republicans taking them back down the Falls Road and stuff like this. I mean, that's all good stuff, and some of the relationships that have been built up over those with people who were former enemies and would have killed each other. I think that's a better Northern Ireland to live in than the one that we had. But I get it that there's people out there who just see nothing but hurt and injustice, and these prisoners walking the streets, and nothing's being done for victims. And I get all that. That's what's said. I get all that, and I understand the hurt and all of that. But I just ask people, just try and think about what this place could be. If you could somehow just be able to draw a line in the sand and say, right, okay, let's move on. Let's try and build new relationships. Let's try and build a new society. Let's try and make this place work for everybody.
I must let you talk about Wave and why it matters to you, why working for them, as you have done for quite a while, matters to you. Do you ever turn anybody away? Do you say you're a victim, you're not a victim?
No, so the Wave Trauma Centre, I have to say to you, Will, has been the greatest privilege of my life to work for this organisation, led by an inspirational woman in Sandra Peake, some incredible staff, board. I mean, the organisation, which started way back in 1991, working with a handful of women that lost their husbands, and then it grew and it expanded over the years, and we now employ around 80 or 90 people. We don't just work with victims of the Troubles, we're also working at institutional abuse victims and also victims of mother and baby homes and all of that. So we've grown up and we've developed quite an extensive knowledge base of trauma. In fact, we actually have 2 master's programs going, one with University College Cork and one with Queen's University Belfast. And we've quite a few people, be it paramedics, police officers, social workers, frontline responders that would come on those courses. So working for Wave and see how it's been developed over the years has been the absolute pleasure. It's been my greatest working privilege. And yes, we do have an ethos where we work with everybody. If you've been traumatised by the Troubles, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a Republican or a loyalist or a nationalist or a unionist, a Catholic or a Protestant. If you've been impacted by the conflict and you come to Wave for help, there is help available.
Even if you were a volunteer of what the authorities would say was a terrorist?
Even if you were a volunteer. Well, now, can I say that, and yet at the same time caveat it with the most important thing about Wave is that it's a safe space for people. So we obviously can't run the risk of, if someone was involved in murder or were involved in the IRA or involved in loyalist paramilitarism, we can't run the risk of them coming into the centre and then bumping into a family member of someone that they would have murdered or would have been, and that can happen because Northern Ireland's a very small place. So we're pragmatic around that. And so anybody that has a terrorist past, and we do quite an extensive search on people before we take them, we very rarely refuse to work with people if they've been involved with a conflict. That's what we do. But we will allow those people to access services off-site or off the premises, so they wouldn't necessarily be coming into WAVE to meet those people in the first instance. But we have to be upfront and honest with people. If you come to WAVE, we are an open and an inclusive organisation. And we work a bit like if you went to the health service or you went to your GP or you went to the doctors. I mean, the doctor doesn't turn around and say, well, hold on a minute, you were in the IRA, I'm not working with you. In fact, my boss, actually, Sandra Peake, who I have a huge amount of respect for, she actually nursed Sean Kelly when Sean Kelly went into the hospital. Now, Sandra didn't turn around and say, well, look, that guy's just after killing 9 people in the Shankill, I'm not working with him. She worked with him and she gave him the absolute, as he should have got. I respect that, because that's just humanity. That's being humane. And so we have, I suppose, really employed the same principle. That's not to say that we're saying that it was okay, that terror was okay. We absolutely don't. We are completely against violence, against terror, against that type of trauma. But yes, for people that were brought up here and through the Troubles, and even if they got involved in the Troubles and some of them did some very horrible things, yes, I mean we're not against working with people like that.
I've been a journalist for about 35 years. I don't know whether that's a positive or a negative thing some days, but it's the truth. So there we are. And we have a habit of trying to put labels on things because we've got 90 seconds to tell a story or whatever. So we talk a lot when we come to cover atrocities about forgiveness. We use that word and we say, so-and-so says they've forgiven so-and-so. And I often wonder if it's really that simple, because some days in your head you might have and other days in your head you might not have. And a lot of people get stuck, I've noticed as well, on the issue of, I can't forgive him because he's not sorry for what he's done. Therefore, forgiveness with repentance, I suppose, as a condition. Yeah. Do you think about those things?
I used to think about that a lot, actually. But now, and maybe this doesn't make me such a good Christian. For me, forgiveness isn't the right word. For me, it's about being able to let go of something so horrendous and so horrific, because if you can't let it go, then eventually it becomes pathological. And eventually then it will start to damage you. It will damage your relationships. It will damage your lifestyle, the sort of things that you do. I mean, I've written a book there some years ago where we looked at the Troubles and Other Losses, where we looked at people who died as an indirect result of the Troubles, and the countless hundreds of people that drank themselves to an early grave, or who got hooked on prescription medication, or went out and did some other risk-taking behaviours because they couldn't get over the person that they lost, is huge. And the book actually looks at some of those stories and looks at the reasons why, and a lot of that was to do with the fact that there was very little support for people at times, and that's why organisations, in fact, like WAVE and others, that actually exist to try to provide support and help for those type of people. Not to let go just meant that you were going to be damaging yourself. Now, for some people, well, that is going to look and feel like forgiveness. Absolutely. I mean, I knew the late Michael McGoldrick before he passed away, a great man who I had huge respect for. Him and Brady, we used to do the speaking circuit together. And I mean, Michael McGoldrick would have been Gordon Wilson, only without the acclaim that Gordon Wilson would have got, because he obviously came to the world as a man of was able to forgive. Michael McGoldrick was the most forgiving person ever in my life. His son, young Michael, was a taxi driver killed in Portadown, and Brady and Michael were just amazing. So I totally respect people like Michael who have come to the position where they're genuinely able to forgive. I had a different kind of a journey when I thought about forgiving Sean Kelly, and I did think about that. I thought about my family. I thought about Sharon's family. I thought about my mother-in-law, Elsie. I thought about Sharon's sister Beth and her brother John, and I thought about their families. I thought about my daughter Zoe, who lost her mother. And I know in my heart that had I have come out and said, look, I forgive Sean Kelly, they would never forgive me. And so why would I do that for someone that I didn't care about, don't think about? I mean, Sean Kelly doesn't enter my thought process from one waking day to the next. Jerry Adams did a lot. Because he became the public face of the Shankill Bombing for me. But Sean Kelly, I don't need to have a relationship with him. I don't want to have a relationship with him. I don't want to have a chat with him or a conversation, or I don't want to give him a hug, I mean, he's back out in the street now. He's survived the Shankill Bomb, and I mean, I hope he's getting on with his life. I don't wish him any harm, but I certainly, don't particularly want to get into a relationship with them. So I have found a way, Will, to let that go. It doesn't hold me back from being a campaigner for peace. I mean, I think most people that know me would know that I'm an avid campaigner for peace and reconciliation. One of my very good friends actually is a former IRA guy. I've not mentioned his name, but I mean, him and I would go walking. We've been to each other's homes and stuff like this, and I respect him. He respects me, and yet he was an IRA guy in the past. So it hasn't stopped me reaching out to hand of friendship to others, just because I haven't come and said I forgive Sean Kelly. But I do understand for some people that they feel they have to do, because it's the only way they can let it go, let the ghost of what happened go. Others, I guess, can't do it, nor can they let it go. And unfortunately, there are the people that that we're still treating in Wave today around PTSD and all the various negative connotations with that. And I suppose part of our work is to try to bring them to a place where they're able to live again and laugh again and love again. But that's not always easy.
It's been 30 years since that bomb did what it did to your life, and you lost Sharon, you lost Desmond, all those people who were killed, all those people who were injured. And I suspect over the years you've learned that what-ifs don't count for anything very much, because you're back where you started at the end of that mental process. This isn't something you did. This is something that happened to you, and your life has therefore happened as a result of it. I'm going to put it this way. What now gets you out of bed? What inspires you to do things, to change? Because you could live very quietly now and just be the granda. Yeah. But you're still not doing that. What makes you act and try and make a difference? You've been hurt enough already, so why go through more risks?
I guess for me, it's a fundamental belief in this place, Northern Ireland, even though I often describe it as a basket case society, and it is. I mean, we have murderers, and I don't just mean, by the way, those that were released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, but we've got others out there, whether it be for political expediency or whatever, that have never faced justice for their crimes. And in fact, they've often played fast and loose with that. I mean, when you can murder a guy as the UVF did in Bobby Muffet in the Shankill Road in broad daylight, I mean, the only conclusion you can draw there is that there's people aren't frightened of law and order. So we have our politicians, I mean, aren't exactly setting the world ablaze. I mean, they're inept, incompetent, unwilling to embrace change. I mean, when you think about the fact that our assembly has been down for the past, year and a half, and 3 years before that was Sinn Féin, because they're not getting their own way. I mean, we live in a basket case society. We really do. And yet, I believe in this place. I believe that we deserve so much better than this. I hope and I pray that the DUP get back into government soon and start delivering for the people of Northern Ireland. I was a Remainer, and I still would have been had we had to do the vote all over again. But given that people voted for Brexit, I now believe that we potentially could have the best of both worlds. I mean, we could be, we are the gateway to the UK and the gateway to the European Union. And if our politicians would get over their narrow-minded little England mentality or little Britain mentality and get around to making this place work, this could be a great place. And I want to play my part in that. My part obviously isn't going to be in attracting inward investment or in building up the economy and stuff like this. My role is really around those relationships, around nationalists and unionists, Republicans and loyalists. I just want to see us have a society where everybody can get along together. And I know that's maybe wishful thinking when you think about it, and maybe it's a bit of a dreamer in me, but I honestly believe that it can happen. I mean, if I can do it, and believe you me, I have more reason than most to hate. I have more reason than most to think about revenge and not to want to embrace this change. And if I can do it, given what happened to me, then why can't other people do it? So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's those relationships. It's working with victims and survivors. It's trying to help them to go on with their lives. I remember actually meeting a lady in a supermarket a long time ago. She had lost her husband in the Troubles, but I didn't know where I knew her from. I'd just been coming to Wave a relatively short period of time, and then I went into Asda in the Shore Road there, and there she was, and she came over to me and she says to me, "Oh, Alan, son," she says, "isn't it awful? Isn't it awful? Aren't you just wanting to die?" And I was sitting there thinking, who is this woman, and why is she talking to me? And I just knew I knew her, but I didn't know where I knew her from. And so I wasn't listening to her. I don't know if you ever had that experience where you're kind of listening, you're nodding along as if you're agreeing with what she's saying, but you're not really listening. And so and then I started repeating what she said. She said, "Oh, it's awful. I just want him to die. It's terrible." Not really knowing who this woman was. And then I was putting my goods through the checkout, and I looked out the window and I could see her getting into her car and she was about to drive off, and I remembered who she was just at that point. And her name was Anne, and she had lost her husband in the Troubles, and she'd come to Wave, and she'd never really gotten over it. I mean, this would have been the 90s, and she lost her husband in the 70s. So I remember running out actually and stopped their car just as she was about to go out the gate, and I knocked the car window, and she opened the window, and I says, "Anne, sorry, look, I am really, really sorry. I just realised who you were. I wasn't really listening to you, but I wanted to tell you this." She says, "What is it? What is it?" And I says, "Listen, when I lost Sharon, I was a very young man, as you were, but I have to say to you, I don't want to die. I don't want life to be over. I want to, go on. I want to live. I want to love. I want to laugh again. I want to dance again. And I want that for you as well. And I think it's really sad that all these years later that you're still suffering and pretty much the way you were when you first lost your husband." And I remember getting into Wave that day and talking to my boss and saying, "What is it that we're doing with our women that come here for help?" Because what we had done was we thought it was enough to bring them together because they'd lost someone, that they would somehow comfort each other. But they weren't comforting each other. They were actually mutually reinforcing their sense of hurt, their sense of loss, their sense of pain. So that space, which we thought was therapeutic, actually turned out to be the opposite of that. And so I remember that we started then to work with these women, and we started to work with them in a very different way. We started to help them to talk about their trauma, but also to try and help them to think beyond their trauma. And today at Wave, we have a citizen education programme led by a fantastic woman, Grania McKenna, and we go into schools, universities, colleges, and we bring people in who have experienced trauma, and they talk not just about the trauma, but also about this thing which we're now calling post-traumatic growth, about how you can actually use the trauma to grow. And so all of those things will get me out of bed in the morning. I want to see this place work. I want victims and survivors to be helped and to be healed, but I want them to go on and to live their lives and for life to be still meaningful, no matter what age they are. Whether they're, at the end of life in their 80s or 90s or whatever, or whether they're just starting out. Life can be good again, and what we have to do is just help people to grasp the vision for that, and then help them with some of the skills and the resources to try and make it a reality.
Alan McBride. Thank you, Alan, for telling me your story one more time. If you want to understand more about all of this, I recommend you go to the BBC iPlayer and watch a series called Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland. Superb television in a 5-part series made by friends and former colleagues of mine. Alan's story is there too, in episode 5, alongside other folk you'll recognise. Have a watch. I think you'll be glad if you do. Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland on the BBC iPlayer. And thanks for listening. Do subscribe to the Commission Files. Kerry Gregg and I are back in the new year with more thoughts on how Christians react to the cost of living crisis, and we'll be looking into an independent assessment of faith, in other words, who believes what, in Northern Ireland right now. And check out our sister podcast, Inspired to Act, where Diane Holt and I look at reconciliation and how to step up and make a difference. See you soon. Bye.